We talked earlier in the show today about this op-ed that was in today's Montreal Gazette, signed by four former members of the Equality Party, basically addressing the situation we have now as far as linguistic tensions are concerned, an upcoming election coming up, and suggesting that the best way to deal with this going forward would not be to vote for one of the protest parties, referring to the Ballarama Wholeness Party, which is called Mouvement Québec. At least it was up until today. Now it's apparently called Bloc Montréal.
Yeah.
Or the Canadian Party of Quebec, the one started in the Eastern Townships by some Anglo rights advocates. So I wanted to get a better line on this. We heard from Jeff Kelly, earlier in the day, suggesting, again, this wasn't the best way to go because you need to get organized. It has to be a concerted attack. And what's the point of, voting for a protest vote when the people, if elected, 3 of them, 4 of them, will basically have no say once they get to Quebec City anyway, which, of course, brought up the idea of the Equality Party from way, way back in the mid-1980s. And how they fared. And, of course, Robert LIBMAN was one of those. So I thought, let's talk to Robert and find out what he thinks. Robert, thanks for being here.
Good afternoon.
Let's start with some perspective time-wise, just to bring people back. So Equality Party, it's the mid-1980s, 1989. What happened? You get elected. What was the whole issue then? It was over still the notwithstanding clause.
Well, yeah. First of all, let me just correct something you said earlier. This opinion piece in the Gazette today was penned by former Liberal MNAs, not former Equality Party MNAs. Liberal MNAs are warning the community to shun any of these protest parties, which is like deja vu all over again. In the 1980s, it was the same type of thing. In 1988, the Bourassa Liberals used the notwithstanding clause to overturn a Supreme Court judgment that said banning English on outdoor commercial signs was unconstitutional. And this created quite a backlash in the Anglophone community. The Anglophone community was extremely upset. They had felt betrayed by the Bourassa Liberals, who had promised in the previous election that they would restore English on outdoor commercial signs, and then he turns around and uses the notwithstanding clause to betray the community. And at the time, the community felt very much abandoned and wanted to seek an alternative. And we filled the void. We created the opportunity for a new political party back in '89 in that election campaign. People felt the need to punish the Liberals or to at least protest against what the Liberals had done. And sure enough, we gained enough momentum and people were angry enough that they elected 4 of us to the National Assembly.
So that said, if I ask you now, are we in the same place we were now that we were back in 1989? Because it would seem it's considerably worse now with respect to Bill 96 and simply no commercial signs in any language other than French.
Well, no, you're allowed commercial signs. You're allowed English on outdoor commercial signs as long as the French is predominant now. That was changed in 1993. So that's something that one should consider even during the 5-year period after the Anglophone community abandoned the Liberals to protest and to show how upset they were with the Liberals. That was the time frame in the National Assembly when the Liberals decided to soften Bill 101. It was the last time Bill 101 was softened. They restored on outdoor commercial signs the right to use English as long as French was predominant. So they changed the law in part because of the protests and how they realized that they had upset the Anglophone community. And we're seeing now the Anglophone community really upset. When was the last time, do you remember, protests in the streets? That march that we had a few weeks ago was very telling, and it certainly shook up many commentators in the French media as well. And that's what has to happen. And that's why I think even in this election, some of the similarities are striking in that if the Anglophone community again abandoned their traditional vote for the Liberal Party, it would be a signal perhaps to the CAQ and Quebec Francophone society at large that maybe this law does go too far. And maybe it is time to take a relook at it when the notwithstanding clause has to be renewed in 5 years from now. So I think certain parallels are there, and it's always important to be able to have a voice in the National Assembly. The op-ed today by those ex-liberals, again, was somewhat condescending and paternalistic towards the community, saying, and it's something that the community is used to hearing from them. They take our vote for granted, and they don't like when our community perhaps steps out of its comfort zone, but that's what's happening now because people are very, very upset.
So I guess based on what you just said, you don't agree with this idea of do not vote for what they call the protest parties.
Well, I think Anglophone Quebecers are intelligent enough and knowledgeable enough to decide how to vote. You know, there's the possibility of working from within an established party. The Liberal Party, it doesn't look like they'll become the government in October anyways. Or is it more valuable to have a voice, an unfettered voice that doesn't have to toe a party line in the National Assembly? And that's what we had for 5 years. Yes, things didn't end well with the Equality Party, but at least during that 5-year period, we were very visible and present within the National Assembly of Quebec. Quebec on the floor of the Assembly. We participated in all the committees. We were not insular, as was suggested in that opinion piece today. We participated, spoke in committee, spoke with the other members, whether it be the Liberals or the PQ. We often voted with the Liberals, but it really was an opportunity for our voices to be heard. And sometimes it's important for our community to make that statement publicly. Other times it's important to work from within an established party. It just depends, and I think each voter is free and intelligent enough to make that determination himself in October.
Why did the Equality Party not last then?
Well, that's a lot has been written about that. One of the factors that was very difficult for us was after the failure of the Meech Lake Accord, after the failure of the Charlottetown Accord, and then with the referendum on the horizon, because as you know, there was a referendum in 1995. So the debate started to polarize again between Federalist and Sovereignist, with the PQ on one side and the Liberals on the other, and many people felt that perhaps let's consolidate the Federalist forces under one umbrella, and people gravitated back towards the Liberal Party with a year before the referendum. But also we had some internal difficulties and struggles. I'm sure Aaron remembers well Richard Holden and a bit of a gadfly that he was in our caucus, who ended up running or becoming the Westmount MNA. He switched from our party to become the sitting MNA for Westmount after trying to get into the Liberal Party, and he was refused. So he was announced. He became a Westmount MNA that belonged to the PQ. You may remember, Aaron,
Sure.
the press conference at Victoria Hall with Jacques Parizeau when he introduced Richard Holden as his new MNA for Westmount. He looked like the cat that swallowed the canary, and rubbing his hands together saying, "I'd like to introduce the PQ MNA for Westmount." Richard Holden, if you recall. And that really did a lot of damage to our party. But at the same time, for 5 years we had a voice. And it's important that our community decides from election to election how they want to be represented, whether it's by an outside force or by a party within one of the parties that could become the government.
You know, you bring up this idea that you were there for 5 years, you had your voice, kind of taking issue with that op-ed in the Gazette today. But one of the questions people say is, okay, you were there for 5 years. What did you manage to accomplish in 5 years beyond just being there and having a voice? What did it tangibly do for the Anglophone community here?
Well, I think, as I said, the election of 4 members of the Equality Party in 1989 really shook up the Francophone establishment in Quebec. It made a lot of news across the country and even in the United States, and it gave pause for reflection by the Liberal Party and many Francophone commentators that Bill 178 at the time, that was the law they passed to overrule the Supreme Court decision, perhaps went too far. And then a few years later, in the National Assembly, we worked very closely with Claude Ryan, and when they brought in what was called Bill 86 at the time, allowing English on signs again, we were very active in that file. We were also we worked on pushing for greater representation in the civil service for Anglophones, the question of access to English schools, which spawned the Chambers report, which the government put in place to look at the ways to improve the health of English schools in Quebec. But, we were there as MNAs, and sometimes the community needs a shot in the arm, a voice to feel that they're represented on the floor of the National Assembly, the inner sanctum of Francophone Quebec. And if nothing more, that was something that at least people felt proud of or comfortable with voting for what they believed in, as opposed to just feeling that they're hostage to the Liberal Party and they have to vote for them in every election. So from that point of view, I think there was some benefit.
Are you going to lend your support to either of these parties?
No, not that ship has sailed, Natasha. I'm done with politics. I get to write an opinion piece every week in the Gazette, which is very important for me. But I won't support any of the parties. I think every individual Anglophone should vote with what they believe in. If they feel that they'd like to be part of a larger political party, the official opposition, which is likely where the Liberals will end up, or if they feel that their voice is best represented by a party fighting from the sidelines within the National Assembly, then I think that's up to each person to decide.
You sound an awful like a politician right about now. But
Do I?
Yeah, a little bit. I want to ask you.
To answer that question?
Well, let me ask you this, though. That's 1989. That's 33 years ago.
Hard to believe, yeah.
That was then, this is now. Would it make as much a difference? Would it have as much of an impact, perhaps, if, in fact, 3 or 4 of these protest party leaders or candidates got elected?
Well, the difference now is that it's the CAQ that's really the object of the community's angst and anger, and they're the government. Anyways, it's not, the anger isn't as focused towards the Liberals as it was back in '89. So there's a difference there. Will the community really fight against the Liberal candidates to elect people when the Liberals aren't really the villain. They're sort of the side villain of this piece.
Well, so would the CAC even care?
I don't know. I think in the ridings that I suspect that they'll be focusing on, the support for the Liberals is strong enough that you can divide the vote several ways, and the CAC can't get elected. I think the CAC will point to the Liberals and call them Le Parti des Anglais. I think it would benefit them in some of their areas. They know that in these ridings they don't have a chance to win anyways, whether it's Darcy McGee or NDG or Westmount. They know that they can't win, so they want to. They'll probably try to pigeonhole the Liberals as much as they can. And the Liberals are going to be caught in that. It'd be interesting to know how the Liberals would have voted on Bill 96 had the polls been better for them. I suspect that they were planning to vote in favor of Bill 96, but realizing that they were dropping in the polls, seeing that these other two parties were being created, I think that they wanted to save the furniture and at least conserve some of these seats on the Island of Montreal, the western part of the island, and therefore decided to vote against Bill 96 when initially they perhaps were thinking of voting in favor of it.
Yeah, you can imagine people hearing you say that, how they must react now to think that they made a political decision as opposed to a moral decision by thinking of voting for this bill.
I'm not saying that necessarily, but it's a possibility, because I know at first they were looking seriously at voting in favor of Bill 96, and some of the Anglo MNAs within the Liberal caucus were probably very nervous about that. But the way things evolved and their loss in numbers and the creation of these other protest parties, they perhaps had to regroup and say, at least let's hold on to what we have and vote against Bill 96 to save that electoral base. It's possible. I'm not saying it's necessarily a fact, but I wouldn't rule that out completely.
Robert, as always, want to thank you for making yourself available. Appreciate it. Always good talking to you.
Pleasure. Take care.
Robert LIBMAN. Think back, 1989, one of the 4 Equality Party members that got elected. That's 33 years ago.